Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody is doing well and enjoying the fall weather, getting ready for Halloween if you celebrate Halloween. Um, I'm Chris Gantt-Sorenson, and I'm here with Katie Busbee. Katie is an associate on the employment law team as well as the economic development team. And Katie assists Perry and I particularly in a number of employment law matters. Some of you on the webinar have already met Katie through working with us, and so we're excited to hear from her today. I will apologize in advance. I am overcoming a flu that has zapped me, and so to avoid coughing in your ears or not being 100% on my game, we're going to let Katie run the show today. But I will be on the chats, responding to questions as they come up as we're able. And granted, Katie's got some great information, so you're certainly not going to even miss me today. Go ahead and go to the next slide. As a reminder, be sure to put your questions in either the Q&A or the chat. I'm going to be monitoring both, and we will address them throughout. Brittany will be sending you the information that you need to claim your credits, whatever those might be. And she will also send you the PowerPoint and a link to the video following our presentation. As always, we want to hear from you as to what you want to hear about. We will always consider that and we'll weave it in. So make sure you're suggesting to us any topics you want to hear. And so I will tell you, Katie has made an appearance on Mike Switzer's program at about 10 till 8 on NPR about interns. And so when was that, Katie?
I think that was back in maybe June or July, I think.
Yep. So you guys ought to check her out. She did really well. And that was a great informative session where she advised on when you can hire interns and pay or not pay and all the rules associated with that. Katie was formerly with the Chamber of Commerce as an assistant lobbyist with the Chamber. And so she had a career before she came to us in law. So we're really lucky to have her. She's been invaluable to the employment team. And with that, I'm going to kick it to Katie. Oh, one more thing about Katie. She played soccer in college.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. I think I've probably had the opportunity to meet a few of you out there from taking a look at the list of attendees. If I haven't got the opportunity to meet you, nice to meet you all virtually. Hope to be able to work with you some in the future here at HSB. So today we're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act. October is ADA Awareness Month, so we wanted to make sure that we covered this topic. And we are trying to focus on business issues this year for our webinars. And so today we're talking about something that has come up a lot recently, and that's kind of this intersection of the ADA and then technology. And so as technology becomes more robust and new technology comes out, there's always these issues cropping up under existing law, and the ADA is no different. And so kind of a roadmap of our discussion here today, I'm going to touch on the Americans with Disabilities Act as far as key provisions that we're going to be talking about today and a little bit of background to kind of frame our discussion. And then we're going to be talking about ADA and website compliance. So making sure that your website is compliant with the ADA and best practices that you can make sure that you're adopting. And then we're also going to be talking about artificial intelligence. So it's no secret that AI is becoming more and more ubiquitous. Employers are using it in their hiring processes. And so the EEOC has also taken notice of this. And so they have put out some recent guidance about potential pitfalls and how that AI could be violating the ADA. And so we're going to talk about some of those today. And then also, again, best practices, things you can be doing to make sure that your website, your artificial intelligence is in compliance. So a little bit, starting off covering a little bit about the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the ADA became law in 1990. It was later amended in 2008. And just from a really high level, broadly, it prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life. So as an employee, when individuals go to school, when you go to a store, when you buy a good, when you receive a service, the ADA covers all of those areas of public life. And it requires certain things if you're an employer, if you're a government employer, if you're a store, all of that's going to be found in the ADA. Next slide. So the ADA has 5 titles, and Title I is really probably the title that all of you are most familiar with as HR professionals. It's certainly the title that we probably interact with the most as far as fielding questions from clients, and that governs how private employers interact with applicants and employees and governs the hiring process. And so we're going to be talking about, when we're talking about artificial intelligence today, a lot of that is going to fall under Title I of the ADA. And then Title II covers government employers, state and local governments. And then Title III, which we're also going to be touching on today, covers public accommodations. And that just means really a public business, a business offering a good or service. And so when we're talking about website compliance today, all of that is going to fall under Title III of the ADA. Next slide. So Title I, like I mentioned, this covers private employers with 15 or more employees. And this is the title that we interact with the most. And just kind of from a high level, this provides the legal framework for accommodations. So under Title I, employers have to provide a reasonable accommodation to an employee that has a disability if that reasonable accommodation would allow that person to perform the essential functions of their job, and if it doesn't impose an undue hardship on the business. And so that is a standard that probably a lot of you are very familiar with as you've interacted with employees that request an accommodation or need one. And that undue hardship standard is really just a sliding scale. Courts kind of take into account, you know, how large the company is, what kind of resources are available to you. But basically, if that employee could do that job with a reasonable accommodation, you have to provide that unless it meets that undue hardship burden. And so all of that falls under Title I of the ADA. And then Title I also provides the legal framework and the requirements for medical inquiries. So what you can and cannot ask before you make a conditional offer of employment. So as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, you know, you can't ask on your applications, do you have a disability? Or you can't make other medical inquiries before that conditional offer of employment. So all of that is also found under Title I, which governs, again, employers with 15 or more employees. Next slide. Title I also gives us the definition of a disability. So individuals that have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And some of those major life activities are there on the slide. And these are very small things that have a very big impact on our everyday lives. So if it affects anything like seeing, bodily functions, communication, neurological functions, all of that, those are major life activities. And that will fall under the definition of disability for Title I. Okay, next slide. Title III covers places of public accommodation. So, you know, a lot of y'all are probably aware of things like when a new business is built or a new building, there are certain code requirements that they have to meet as far as being handicap accessible. All of that falls under Title III, but it also applies more broadly than that. And that's kind of where we're going to get into this discussion of websites today. And so it applies to a place of public accommodation. And it requires places of public accommodations to make certain changes in their practices and policies and procedures so that they're not discriminating against individuals with disabilities. And those individuals can still buy goods, can still receive services just like anyone else. So a place of public accommodation is a privately owned or leased facility that affects commerce and falls within one of 12 categories. And there are some small carve outs for this for private clubs, and then also for some religious organizations with some exceptions. But basically, if you're privately owned, you fall within, if you affect commerce and you fall within these categories, you're under Title III of the ADA. So next slide. So we have some lists on this slide and the next that lists all of the definitions of a place of public accommodation. And I'm not going to go through all that because y'all can definitely read and take a look at that. But just kind of common sense, it applies to basically if you provide a good or service, you're going to be under this. And so if you look at number 6, it kind of has this, it says it even provides or applies to other service establishments. So it's kind of a broad catch-all that encompasses mostly anyone that's going to provide a good or service. And so next slide, and that just kind of continues the list. So we're talking restaurants and museums and anywhere that's open to the public, and then also anyone providing a service. So Title III requires all these places of public accommodations to make modifications in their policies, practices, and procedures if necessary, when that's necessary to afford goods and services to individuals with disabilities, as long as that modification doesn't fundamentally alter the good or service. So it's kind of a similar standard that we find under Title I. Title I requires you to provide a reasonable accommodation, absent undue hardship. And then Title III requires businesses to make modifications, make changes in how they do business, as long as that doesn't fundamentally alter their good or service. But you are required under Title III to do that. Okay, next slide. So all of that kind of lays the groundwork for websites. And so Title III actually does not mention websites at all. So Title III, or the ADA, became law in 1990. Computers, of course, we know computers were very different in 1990, as you can see from the screen. It's the year before I was born. So I doubt that probably any business was selling goods and services over the web at that point. And so the ADA doesn't address websites. And there's been a lot of push by individuals and groups for the Department of Justice and for the government to release guidelines on websites for the ADA. And up until this point, they've really chosen not to do that. They've made some recommendations, which we're going to get into. But, you know, if you pull Title III of the ADA, you're not going to find a list of things that say, do this, do that with your website. You're not going to be able to find that. And so it kind of raises this question that's come up a lot in recent case law is a website a place of public accommodation under Title III? So does my website have to comply with what's in Title III of the ADA, just like my brick and mortar store would have to comply with that? Next slide. And so the Department of Justice has basically come out and said, yes, a website is a place of public accommodation. So they haven't promulgated specific guidelines, but they did issue a short letter a couple years ago in 2018, or 4 years ago, sorry, COVID time. 4 years ago now, they did issue a short letter to a member of Congress who had inquired about his concerns with websites and public accommodations as far as the ADA. And so the Department of Justice issued this letter, and they made the statement that The department has consistently taken the position that the requirements apply, the Title III requirements apply to all goods and services offered by public accommodations, including those offered on the web. So that is the position that they have adopted. And they did not in that short letter, state exactly what businesses had to do, but they did say, listen, it's on you, the business, to figure out how to comply with the ADA and make sure you're doing that as far as your website goes. Next slide. So courts are split on this question. The DOJ has their position, and litigation that has come up since then, there's been some varying case law across the country. And so one issue that seems to crop up a lot is businesses that only offer goods and services over a website and they don't have a brick and mortar store. Is that really a place of public accommodation? And so the First Circuit, the Fourth Circuit, and Seventh, which South Carolina were in the Fourth Circuit, so that's why I have that bolded there. All those circuits have taken the position that a website can be a public place, a place of public accommodation, independent of any physical space. So even if you're just providing goods and services over the web, you don't have a brick and mortar store, your website is still going to fall under Title III. Other courts across the country have taken a little bit of a different position. They've said that if your website has a sufficient nexus to a physical space, then yes, you have to comply with Title III. And so they would kind of take a position that if you're just selling goods and services over the website, you don't have a brick and mortar space or a physical space, Title III might not apply to you in those jurisdictions. It's kind of a case-by-case basis though. And then there's some conflicting case law on this in the Second Circuit and the 11th Circuits, where they've kind of straddled both positions. And so there's not a clear-cut decision in those circuits. Next slide. So because Title III doesn't exactly tell us what to do with our websites, case law and the DOJ's position do kind of provide a framework for how businesses are supposed to make sure that their websites are compliant with the ADA. And the department has stated that because Title III doesn't specifically address this, there's some flexibility in how you can go about making sure that you're ADA compliant. Next slide. So DOJ has put out their recommendations as far as they don't have specific guidelines, but they have said, we recommend that your website comply with the web content accessibility guidelines, which you can find online. And we also have some links in the presentation today where you can find those. And so that's a standard that they have put out there that they recommend businesses comply with to make sure that you are ADA compliant. And so those guidelines are updated every so often. They're actually getting ready to issue another update in December. And so a lot of times in case law over these issues, you'll see courts make recommendations or require companies to please comply with WCAG 2.0 guidelines. And so that's kind of a common standard that the DOJ and courts are using to hold businesses accountable. And so a lot of what we talk about today, all of that is taken straight from those guidelines. And then there are also Section 508 guidelines that the government has put out. And those are requirements for all government websites and government contractors. So there are more specific guidelines if you fall under Section 508. And so those also can kind of be, provide some goalposts as far as what your website should be doing to be ADA compliant. So this is important because we're seeing a rise in litigation with this. And so website accessibility lawsuits, according to this study by Haynsworth, rose 14% last year and 12% the year before. And so there are there are groups out there, there are law firms that basically do nothing but these types of lawsuits. And we actually, Chris and I were talking a little bit earlier, we've had to help several clients with this, as far as they've received these letters from these law firms that specialize in this, basically threatening lawsuits because their website isn't ADA compliant. And so we've had to help, clients respond to those letters. And so, you should just be aware that there are legal shops out there that, they go out there, they find what they feel like would be a good plaintiff, and all day long, they're just sending these letters and trying to bring these lawsuits. And so that's why it's important. You definitely don't want to be in a position where you could get one of these letters and be caught completely off guard that your website was even supposed to be compliant with the ADA. And so I have listed there just a few companies that the Department of Justice has entered into some settlements with, and some recent case law from 2021, as far as companies being forced to comply with the WCAG guidelines with their websites. And the Domino's case is kind of interesting because Domino's tried to put forth this argument that their website and their apps didn't fall under the ADA because all of their stores were franchises and the company didn't actually own any physical stores. And so the court rejected that argument. And so it's just kind of interesting to think about, kind of keep that in mind, that there are some courts that are willing, even if you're a franchisee or in that situation, you still want to make sure that your website is in compliance. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about common barriers and then best practices as far as website accessibility. And again, all of these items that we're going to talk about come straight from those WCAG guidelines. And so these are things that you want to make sure your website is currently doing, or if it isn't fixed that way yet, you want to be aware of that and start making some changes to make sure you're ADA compliant. So first, when you're thinking about your website, and I was talking to someone the other day about this, and they were asking me, that's such a foreign concept. Like, why wouldn't someone with a disability be able to access my website, apart from maybe vision being maybe the one that comes to the top of mind? But really, this kind of can affect many people with disabilities. So not only those that are vision impaired, but also hearing impaired. It can affect individuals with epilepsy if you have blinking or moving content on your website. It can affect people that have motor skill function issues, that have difficulty using a mouse or a keyboard to navigate your website. And then probably most broadly, it can really affect people with learning disabilities and cognitive disorders, and being able to navigate your website, find the information they need, and be able to buy goods or receive services over your website. So it can really affect a lot of individuals with disabilities. Next slide. So I'm going to go through a few of these barriers or these issues that the guidelines have highlighted, and really best practices you can adopt to make sure that you're ADA compliant. And probably the one that comes up the most when I was looking through the guidelines and some anecdotes about this is the ability for screen readers to be able to read your website. So people that have vision impairments often use screen readers. Individuals that are blind, of course, use screen readers, and a screen reader takes the text on the website and converts it to speech, or sometimes converts it to Braille. And so if your website isn't screen reader capable, then they're not going to be able to use your website. And so making sure that screen readers are accurately narrating your website and also converting all of your text to speech or to Braille, that's really important, and something you'll want to talk to whoever's hosting your website, that it has that capability. Mouse only navigation, this is also an issue that pops up a lot with screen readers or magnifiers. A lot of these use keyboard navigation instead of mouse navigation. So it'll require certain keyboard commands. So if your website doesn't recognize keyboard commands, that also can be an issue, and you want to make sure that it's allowing you to do that. Next slide. Relying on color instead of text. So we've all had to fill out, online types of forms. And so this is something that you've definitely seen before and are familiar with. So on the screen to the left, you have, a green box because you filled in that box and you didn't fill in the red boxes. And a lot of people could look at that and say, okay, green means good, I filled it in. Red means I haven't filled it in yet. But of course, somebody that is blind, colorblind, or maybe just has a harder time understanding what that's trying to convey, that's gonna cause a problem. And a screen reader also is not going to be able to pick that up. So you want to make sure that there's always alternative text paired with any colors that you have. So over on the right, you'll see where it says, you still got the red box, but it says error. This is a required field. So a screen reader is going to be able to pick that up. They're going to be able to read that error message, and it's just easier to understand what that color is trying to convey. Another thing I know that I see a lot is like a red asterisk when you haven't filled something out. And so if you're only having that and you don't have any text to go along with that, again, that's just a screen reader is not going to be able to pick that up. Oops, sitting too still, light's cutting off. A screen reader is not going to be able to pick that up. So you need text to be able to go along with that. Next slide. A lack of text with images. Of course, if you have someone that has a visual impairment, if you just have images on your website and no text to go along with that, they're not going to be able to understand what that image is supposed to be conveying. So make sure you always have alternative text for your images. Contact information for technical support, and then also contact information for requesting an accommodation. So a lot of websites will have contact information for tech support, but you also want to make sure that somebody is responsible for fielding any requests for a reasonable accommodation, and that when those requests come in, they know how to quickly handle those or address that or field it to the appropriate person. And so making sure that, somewhere on your website states that, if you need or require an accommodation to be able to do something on our website or be able to buy something, here's the contact person for that, and you can certainly request that. So making sure that information is clearly displayed on your website. Captions on videos. So all of your videos, if you have a video on your website, should have captions so that those with visual or hearing impairments can be able to understand those videos. Next slide. Insufficient color contrast. This one is probably pretty common, especially with companies that haven't updated their websites in a while. So this really affects those that are colorblind. So you can actually, on my phone last night when I was going through this, you can actually download an app on your phone called Chromatic Vision Simulator, and it will show you what things look like to people who are colorblind or have visual impairments. And so you can actually just hold your phone up to your website and see what it looks like to someone that's colorblind. And so, or just having trouble seeing too. So it's really important that your website has sufficient color contrast. And if we go to the next slide, we have a couple examples of that. So you'll see on the left, this is an example that is insufficient color contrast because you have dark words on dark backgrounds, or you have light words on a light background. And so that's going to be hard for people that have visual impairments to be able to see that and understand that. And then over on the right, you have the opposites. You have dark words with the light background or light words with the dark background. And that's just a lot easier to read and see. And so really your website should have that sufficient color contrast. Next slide. Inaccessible online forms. So if you have forms on your website that people need to be able to download, applications, just any other kind of form, you need to make sure that everything is properly labeled and that there is keyboard access. When we talk about those keyboard commands again, make sure that you can tab between those fields or perform other keyboard commands on those forms. And then also just provide clear instructions on how to download forms, submit forms, all of those types of things. If people have trouble finding those on your website or accessing them, that can be a real issue. Insufficient text size and zoom capability. You want to make sure that all of your text on your website is nice and large, easy for people to read, and that your website allows people to zoom in. And so the WCAG guidelines recommend up to 200% without losing the content or the functionality of the website, so that people can make things larger and see better. Headings in your website layout. So if your website doesn't have sufficient headings, it's really hard for anyone to navigate your website, but definitely people with more that have a harder time, cognitive disabilities, for them to be able to make sense of where things are on your website. And so sufficient headings, that's going to help with that. And then also making sure the headings are built in to the layout of the website, so that when you click on a heading, it's kind of logical and common sense where that page goes next. And then there's other headings to direct you there. All of that's built into the navigation tools. That's going to help individuals be able to access your website. Blinking and moving content, I kind of mentioned this earlier. This can be a trigger for individuals with epilepsy. You don't want to have blinking content on your website. And if you do have content that moves, you want to make sure that there is a stop or a pause button that someone can press to stop that movement on the screen. Timed content, if you have content on your website, videos, or, I'm thinking about these scrolling headings that a lot of people have on their websites. You just want to make sure that people can sufficiently go back and see things or start and stop that content, and still navigate with things that time out for people that need a little bit longer to look at it, and be able to understand what's going on. Confusing language. You want to use plain language, plain, simple, concise language on your website. That's just always going to be easier for people to digest. So you want to make sure that you're doing that. Next slide. So those are all, again, all the best practices that we just talked about come straight from the WCAG guidelines. Those guidelines go a lot more in depth than what we just covered, but those are kind of all the high points. And again, we have a link at the end of the presentation that takes you to those guidelines. So, a lot of you may not be in charge of your websites at your offices, but it would still be worth contacting whoever is your IT or your marketing departments to say, hey, I was in this session today. We want to make sure we're in compliance with these guidelines so that we're in compliance with the ADA. So next, we're going to be looking at the ADA and artificial intelligence. And so this is bringing us back to Title I of the ADA. And so it's not news to anyone that a lot of people are using artificial intelligence in their hiring processes or in communicating and interacting with employees more than ever. And so the EEOC has taken notice of this and has put out some guidelines for us to talk about. Next slide. So again, this puts us back under Title I. And so we have the link for the EEOC guidelines, and all of the recommendations that we're going to be talking about come from those guidelines. Next slide. Some examples of ways that businesses are using artificial intelligence today. And I know that probably many of you out there, your companies are probably already using this. I know several jobs that I had before I came to HSB, we were using a lot of these same softwares for hiring. And so resume scanners that weed out resumes that don't have certain keywords. A lot of people are using them for applications online as far as chat bots. And so when somebody goes onto a website and is filling out an application, there's a chat bot there that's also asking that candidate certain questions. And then the chat bot is screening out people based on those answers. Video interviewing software that is evaluating a person's expressions or their speech patterns, or even just how long they're taking to respond to questions. Some companies are starting to use that software. And then a lot of testing software and this concept of gamification. When people apply for positions, a lot of times companies will ask them to take a test or play some kind of game that is designed to test their aptitude for that position. And then in this age of work from home, some companies are using AI to monitor employees and monitor their keystroke rates to kind of keep tabs on how productive they're being. And so those are just some examples of how AI has kind of worked its way into hiring processes and employee processes. Next slide. So the guidance that the EEOC put out really highlighted 3 areas where AI can potentially run afoul of the ADA, and things that employers really need to be aware of when you're using these kind of softwares in your hiring process or in how you communicate with your employees. And so the first, probably most significant potential pitfall is that these AI softwares are not always very good at determining who needs a reasonable accommodation, or if that individual could do the job with a reasonable accommodation. So again, we talked a little bit about Title I and that reasonable accommodation standard, that you have to provide that if it allows the employee to be able to do the job and it doesn't provide or pose an undue hardship on the business. And so a reasonable accommodation is just any change that allows that employee to be able to do their job, or applicant to apply for the job, or just to take and partake in any of the benefits of employment. Anything that the company can do to make them enjoy those benefits just like anyone else. So AI tools are not always programmed in a way that really take this into account. And so we're going to get into that a little bit more in the next few slides. This issue of screen out kind of goes hand in hand with reasonable accommodations. So a screen out occurs when an individual is applying for a job or applying for a promotion, and the AI tool causes them not to be able to perform so well, or their disability causes them not to be able to perform so well on that assessment or in applying for that job. And as a result, they are screened out. Those applications a lot of times don't ever make it to the person that's doing the hiring, and they lose the job as a result of that. And so the EEOC has said that if you have an employee or an applicant that is applying for a job and they are being screened out, but they could have done that job if they were provided a reasonable accommodation, then this is violating the ADA. And so it kind of goes hand in hand with what we were talking about before, with this concept of AI is always not the best at knowing who needs that reasonable accommodation. And so I think we have a couple examples of when a screen out occurs. So this is one example where this can pop up. It says, so Sally is applying for a position at your company. She's online, she's filling out an application. The chatbot on the application asked Sally to fill in her employment history. The chatbot has been programmed to reject all applicants who have significant gaps in the applicant's employment history. Sally was unemployed for 8 months while she was receiving treatment for her disability. As a result, when she fills this in on the application, she is screened out by the chatbot. But Sally could have performed the essential functions of that job with a reasonable accommodation. So this is an example of something that would violate Title I. There's nothing in the AI software that is taking into account the fact that Sally was out of a job or had a gap in her employment because of her disability, and she could actually perform the job she was applying with a reasonable accommodation. So that's what happens when we're talking about this idea of screening out. Next slide. This is another way that this can kind of come up. So Tom is applying for a job with his company in a different office. As part of the application, he's asked to play a game that is supposed to determine his performance under high stress situations, which involves many noises and distractions throughout the game. Tom is a veteran and suffers from PTSD. He does not perform well in loud, chaotic environments due to his PTSD. As a result, Tom is screened out due to his score on the game. But Tom could have performed his duties in a quiet environment, and the company could have offered that as a reasonable accommodation. So this is an example of a violation of Title I, because there's nothing that the AI tool could really take into account as far as Tom might not be in that same stressful situation. So if Tom, let's say, kind of was going through a normal application process, and he, was able to tell you, well, I really work better. I could do this job if I was just in an office with the door shut instead of being out in like a noisy cubicle area, and he could still perform those same functions. Well, if that's a reasonable accommodation that the company can provide, then they have to do that. And so there's nothing in the AI tool that really takes into account that the applicant could be performing that job in a different environment than the one that it's pre-programmed to test the applicant for. Okay, next slide. So another way that these AI tools can potentially violate the ADA is with medical inquiries. So the ADA under Title I, when you are hiring, when an applicant is going through the process, you are not allowed to make disability-related inquiries before a conditional offer of employment. So you can't, on your application, I think I mentioned this earlier, you can't say, do you have a disability? You can't pose a direct question like that, but you also can't ask questions that would elicit information about a person's physical or mental well-beings. That's something that qualifies as a medical examination under Title I. And so until you make that conditional offer of employment, you can't ask those certain types of questions. So if you're using an AI tool that has some kind of logic branching built into the application process, it's asking certain questions, you really have to be careful what it's asking and what the next question is based on that answer to make sure that it's not eliciting information that would qualify it as a medical examination under the ADA. Next slide. So a lot of companies, the EEOC specifically addressed this in their guidelines. A lot of companies, of course, outsource this to a third party. So they use a software vendor, or maybe they use some kind of HR consulting to do hiring more on the front end. And so the EEOC addressed this in their guidance and basically said, hey, even if you are using a third party to administer this AI software, if you're using a third party to do kind of this frontline hiring, you as the employer are still responsible for making sure that all of this complies with the ADA. So basically, you're not going to get it out just because you're using some kind of third party software. So you want to remember that as well. Next slide. So these are some best practices that the guidance has put out when you're looking to use some kind of AI software in your hiring or in communicating or testing your employees. If you are kind of shopping around for some software, if you're talking to vendors or talking to sales reps about the software, you want to make sure that you specifically ask them, in building this software, did it take into account how it might affect individuals with disabilities? Did the people writing this code and putting this together really have this in mind on how this can affect individuals with disabilities? And, of course, depending on who you're talking to, that sales rep might not know anything of what you're talking about, but you really need to dig into that issue and make sure that they've done their due diligence in trying to make sure that it complies with the ADA. You also want to make sure that the interface of the AI when applicants are accessing that or your employees is accessible, just like we talked about all of those things with a website. Well, all of that applies here because it's digital content that you're putting out. And so you want to make sure that all of that is accessible in the same ways. If you are developing your own AI, some companies go that route. You definitely just want to make sure you're consulting with experts, with psychologists and people that work with individuals with disabilities to make sure that whatever you're putting together and building is not screening people out, and that you're really going through the process and steps of thinking, how does this affect someone with a cognitive or intellectual or mental health related disability or a physical impairment. Next slide. You want to make sure that the software that you're using, just like on a website, that somewhere on that software there is clear instructions for how to request an accommodation. It needs to state, this test is designed to do this, this, and this. If you need a reasonable accommodation, or if you need an accommodation, please contact this person, and we'll, start that interactive process with you. There needs to be clear instructions on that AI tool for people to be able to contact someone and access that. You also want to make sure that there are alternative formats and alternative tests available. So if someone is having a hard time doing something online, there should be, a paper format that they could use, or some other format and alternative that they could complete and fill out, and be able to still apply for the job or take the assessment or whatever it may be. You also want to make sure that any accommodation requests that come through, that your staff is trained on how to respond to those or funnel them to the appropriate person. Next slide. So this is really, if you're using some kind of AI tool to test applicants, or again, that gamification kind of method that's really popular right now, you want to provide the person that is applying or taking that test the most information possible about what that is designed to test, how that game is going to be structured and play out, so that they're able to kind of say to themselves, you know what, this might be something that my disability could affect my score, could affect my performance on this, and maybe I need to ask if I can do something different. So you want to make sure that you just provide the applicant or your employee the most information possible about what that test or that game is trying to assess. You also want to make sure, and this is true of your AI software and just job descriptions in general, that the qualifications, the job requirements that you're listing or that you're building into the AI logic, that those are truly necessary for the job that the person is applying for. So, one example that comes to mind is if you have somebody that's applying for a job to be a cashier, you wouldn't necessarily want to have as a requirement in the AI tool that this person be able to stand for 3 or 4 hours a day? Because you could provide that person a reasonable accommodation, a chair. Most people could provide them a chair and they could do that same job. So you just want to make sure that any requirements that you're building into your AI tool are truly necessary for that job, because otherwise you're going to be inadvertently screening out people that could do the job with a reasonable accommodation. And then last, you want to make sure that any of those tests or those gamifications that you're using are really trying to score or measure the person's aptitudes directly and not in some kind of abstract manner or method. The more kind of abstract it becomes, people with disabilities or cognitive disabilities or any of those things are just going to have a little bit of a harder time. And if it's a timed assessment, even more so. You want to make sure that you're measuring aptitudes directly and not in some kind of abstract scoring method. So I think, okay, we're a little bit early on time, and I apologize, I have not been checking the chat as diligently as I should have been, but it looks like Chris and Perry have been responding to some things, so thanks, guys. On this last page, we have the link for the website content accessibility guidelines. So you can access those. You can make sure, you can kind of read through them and see, you know, is our website really compliant? You can also provide those guidelines to whoever at your company is in charge of your website. And we also have the link for the EEOC guidance on artificial intelligence so that you can read through that guidance and some of the recommendations that they make as well. So, oh, okay. I think I'm out of slides, Chris. I don't know if any questions popped up, though, that we still need to respond to, or if you and Perry covered all of them.
I think we're good. I think you were so thorough. And someone noted that the size of your letters on the PowerPoint were good. So it makes us go back and think what ours might have been in past. But no, very informative, Katie. Thank you. And I will add that there was a time period when they thought those guidelines, the DOJ's guidelines about the website, were going to be promulgated as requirements. So pretty much our advice has been better to be preventative and go ahead and comply. We all know that with any administrative agency, if you don't comply with their guidelines and they're ever asked to determine whether or not you your website violated Title III, they're going to, of course, rely on their guidelines. So it's important to go ahead and comply with those to the extent that you're not precluded from doing so, just because that's the measure you'll be judged by. So that's typically been our recommendation, whether they end up making those regulations or not. But do know that at one point there was, some discussion that was going to be the case. So Katie, thank you very much. These are tough topics.
I forgot one thing. Sorry.
Okay.
I did forget to mention one thing important on the AI. So I also want to tell you on the artificial intelligence level, there are some states that have specific guidelines. So South Carolina does not have specific laws around artificial intelligence, but if you're in another state, if you're operating somewhere else, just kind of flag that in the back of your mind that some states do have certain requirements on that. Okay, got my last bit in there.
Yes. No, I'm glad you reminded them of that. That's very important. That is an area where state law has to be checked in addition to federal. And so there are, you're right, a number of states that have laws about that. So Katie, those were tough topics to cover on a webinar. They were very informative, and thank you. And everyone, thank you for attending. November 17 is our next webinar. Demetrius Pyburn will be covering it, and he's going to approach employee onboarding, and he's going to be hitting several different topics and several different ideas about retaining talent and how you can actually do that as early as your onboarding process. So I hope you'll join us. We are tentatively also planning something in December. It won't obviously be on the fourth Thursday, So be looking for our blogs about that. As always, if you're not a member or signed up for the blog, please do. And thank you for attending. A little bit early out is never a bad thing, Katie. Thank you, Katie.
Thanks for joining this webinar presented by Haynsworth Sinkler Boyd. To learn more about the firm and its services, visit hsblawfirm.com.